The wind on Whisper Rock Ridge was a sculpture of bone. It peeled the bark from the pines and scoured the granite until it gleamed like a bleached skull in the thin, winter light. This was Jedediah's world, a kingdom of self-imposed exile, furnished with silence and memory. The cold was a constant companion, a presence more real than the ghost of his wife, Sarah, or the laughing echo of his daughter, Lily. He was a man who had burned his past to the ground and chosen to live in the ashes. The fire had taken them, a flash of orange against a night sky that still seared the back of his eyes. He had been away, tracking a lost steer, and his failure was the foundation upon which he had built this penitent's cabin. Each sunrise was a judgment, each sunset a reprieve. The world beyond the ridge had faded into rumor, a place of noise and complication he had no use for. His hands, once gentle enough to braid his daughter's hair, were now callous tools for chopping wood and setting snares. They had failed at their most important task, and he would never ask them to hold anything precious again. But the world, indifferent to a man's grief, has a long memory and a cruel sense of humor. On a Tuesday, when the snow fell not as flakes but as a solid white sheet, a sound broke the pact of silence he'd made with the mountain. A faint, desperate knocking. It was a sound that did not belong here, a sound of the very world he had fled. He gripped the handle of his axe, his knuckles white. It could be a lost hunter, or worse, a man with trouble to share. And trouble, Jedediah knew, was a contagion. He did not move. Let the wind take the sound. Let the snow bury it. But it came again, weaker this time, a frantic scratching, like a wounded animal at the door. It was the sound of a small hand. A terrible, familiar sound. Against every instinct, against the will that had kept him frozen in his grief for 6 years, he opened the door a crack. A small girl, no older than Lily would have been, stood there, her face a pale, bruised moon in the swirling white. She was draped in a thin blanket, her lips blue. She looked up at him with eyes that held no tears, only a terrifying, adult clarity. Then she spoke, her voice a fragile whisper against the gale. "They hurt Mommy," she said, her small body trembling. "Now they want me too," and then, as if her duty was done, she crumpled into the snow at his feet, a dark heap against the unforgiving white. The world had just knocked on his door and demanded an answer. Jedediah carried her inside, his movements stiff and unfamiliar. The girl weighed almost nothing, a bundle of twigs and terror. He laid her on the cot by the hearth, the one that had been Lily's, a space he hadn't looked at directly in years. The warmth of the fire began to coax some color back into her cheeks, revealing a tapestry of abuse. A dark bruise bloomed across her temple, and a cut on her lip had bled onto her chin. He fetched a basin of warm water and a clean cloth, his hands clumsy in their task. It was an act of mercy, but it felt like a betrayal of his isolation, a crack in the fortress of his solitude. She was a splinter of the outside world, lodged deep and painful. As he dabbed gently at the cut, her eyes fluttered open. They were dark and deep, and they watched his every move with the wariness of a rabbit in a snare. He worked in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the howling of the wind that seemed to be trying to claw its way inside. He felt a question in her gaze, a demand for a name, an explanation, but he offered none. Names were for the living, and he was something else. He was a monument to what was lost. He offered her a tin cup of broth, and she drank it slowly, her small hands wrapped around the doll she clutched to her chest. It was a simple thing, made of corn husks and scraps of cloth, but she held it like an anchor. He saw the ghost of another doll, a wooden horse he'd carved for Lily, and a wave of nausea washed over him. He turned away, busying himself with the fire, stoking the flames until they roared, as if he could burn the memory out of the air. When he turned back, she was watching him again. "They had silver stars," she said, her voice stronger now. "The man who owns the valley." He said Mommy knew too much. Jedediah felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the storm. The man who owned the valley was Baron Croft, a name spoken in hushed tones even on this remote ridge. A man who bought lawmen like cattle and land with ink and intimidation. This was not some random act of frontier violence. This was an execution. And this child was the last witness. The firelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows across the cabin walls. For a moment, the girl's silhouette looked just like Lily's. He had failed to save his own. And now, fate had delivered another child to his door, pursued by the same darkness, the same greed that devoured everything it touched. He was a broken man, but even a broken thing can be used as a shield. The morning broke, clear and cold, the world outside glazed in ice. The silence that returned was different now, heavier. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of a held breath. Jedediah watched the girl, who called herself Elara, as she slept. He saw the rise and fall of her chest, a fragile rhythm against the stillness of the room. He should have taken her down to the town of redemption, left her with the sheriff. But the girl's words echoed in his mind. They had silver stars. The law in redemption was just another asset on Croft's ledger. Taking her there would be like returning a lamb to a wolf. He was still wrestling with this impossible choice when he heard it, the crunch of hooves on frozen snow. He moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the shutters. 3 riders, silhouetted against the bright morning sun. One wore the glint of a deputy's star. Finch! Croft's chief dog, a man whose cruelty was a local legend. Jedediah's heart, a slow, dormant thing, began to hammer against his ribs. He turned to the girl, who was now awake, her eyes wide with the same terror he'd seen the night before. Under the floor, he whispered, his voice a low growl. He pulled back the bearskin rug, revealing a small root cellar. Do not make a sound. No matter what you hear. She scrambled inside without a word, pulling the doll in with her. He replaced the rug just as a heavy fist hammered on the door. He took a breath, composing his face into a mask of weary indifference, and opened it. Deputy Finch stood there, flanked by 2 hard-faced men. Finch was a lean man with a smile that never reached his pale, dead eyes. Morning, Jedediah, he said, the greeting an insult. Bit of a storm last night. We're looking for someone. A little girl. Wandered off from her mother. The lie was as thin as the ice on the creek. Ain't seen a soul in months, Jedediah replied, his voice flat. Finch's eyes roamed the cabin, lingering on the small cot, the extra blanket. Funny. We tracked her this far. Little footprints in the snow. Then they just stop. Right about here. He took a step forward, trying to peer inside. Jedediah didn't move, blocking the doorway with his body. Wind plays tricks, Jedediah said. So does the snow. Buries things. The 2 men stood there, a silent battle of wills waged in the frozen air. Finch's smile tightened. Crofts put up a reward. $100. A man could do a lot with that. He was probing for a weakness, for the greed that lived in all men. But Jedediah's currency was guilt, and he was already rich in it. I got no use for money, he said. Finch stared at him for a long moment, then shrugged, a gesture of false defeat. Well, if you see anything, you know where to find us. They mounted their horses and rode away, their dark shapes shrinking against the vast, white expanse. Jedediah closed the door, the click of the latch echoing like a gunshot. He knew this wasn't over. It was a warning. He had been given a chance to step aside, and he had refused. He had lied. He had chosen. The silence from beneath the floorboards was absolute. He lifted the rug and helped Elara out of the darkness. She was trembling, but her gaze was steady. She held out the corn-husk doll. Mommy said to show it to someone with kind eyes, she whispered. Jedediah looked from her face to the doll, a profound weariness settling over him. He was not a man with kind eyes. His eyes were hollowed-out things, windows into a vacant room. But he took the doll, its weight insignificant in his large, scarred hand. He felt a lump in its torso, something hard and unnatural. With his thumb, he carefully worked at the stitching on its back. Inside, nestled within the husks, was a small, tightly rolled cylinder of oilskin, sealed with wax. He unrolled it on the table. It was a map, hand-drawn with meticulous care, but it was unlike any map of the valley he had ever seen. It showed the Blackwood River and, next to it, a faint, dotted line, a proposed new channel, a massive diversion that cut straight through the lands of the independent ranchers and the Ute Reservation downstream. It was a death sentence for a dozen families and an entire people, a slow strangulation by thirst. Notes in the margins detailed water flow measurements, geological weaknesses, and dates of secret surveys. It was a document of pure, calculated greed. "My mother was a cartographer for the railroad survey," Elara said, her voice quiet but firm. "She found what Mr. Croft was planning. He offered her money to change the official maps, to make the diversion look like the river's natural course. She refused." Jedediah stared at the map, the pieces clicking into place. The fire set on ranches that refused to sell. The families that had just packed up and left in the middle of the night. It wasn't misfortune, it was a campaign. "She made a copy," Elara continued, her finger tracing the path of her mother's pen. "She was taking it to the federal marshal in Denver. But they found us on the trail." Her voice faltered for the first time. "They burned the wagon." Everything. Jedediah looked at the map, then at the child. This small piece of oilskin was not just a map, it was a testament. It was a truth that had cost a woman her life. And Croft would stop at nothing to bury it, and the last person who knew it existed. The cabin, once a fortress against the world, now felt like a trap. The silence he had cultivated for years was no longer a comfort, it was the sound of complicity. He had run from a fire once before. He could not outrun this one. The decision settled not with a crash, but with a quiet, grim finality. They could not stay. Finch would be back, and next time he would not bother with questions. Jedediah moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in years, the rust of his grief flaking away to reveal the sharp-edged scout he used to be. He packed a leather satchel with dried meat, hardtack, and a small tin of medical supplies. He checked his rifle, the action smooth and familiar in his hands. He was no longer just a widow attending the grave of his past, he was a guardian, and his duty was to the small, living girl who watched his every move. He handed her a pair of thick wool socks and a small coat he had kept in a trunk, one that had belonged to Lily. The gesture was heavy with unspeakable pain, but it was necessary. The past had to serve the present, or it was nothing but a ghost story. "We move at nightfall," he said, his first command. "The snow will cover our tracks." By morning they left the cabin as a sliver of moon rose over the ridge, leaving a single lamp burning in the window as a decoy. The cold was a physical blow, a thief of breath and warmth. The world was a study in black and white, the snow a vast, luminous sea under the moonlight, the pines standing like silent, dark sentinels. Jedediah led the way, breaking the trail, Elara following in his footsteps. He taught her how to walk without sound, how to use the shadows of the rocks and trees for cover. And as they walked, the landscape he knew as a prison began to reveal itself as an ally. He knew its secrets, its hidden paths, its hollows and ravines where a man and a child could disappear. For hours they moved in silence, a rhythm of crunching snow and labored breaths. He was acutely aware of the small life behind him, a fragile flame he had to shield from the wind. He was no longer just running from his own demons. He was leading someone else away from hers. The ghosts of Sarah and Lily walked with him, not as accusers anymore, but as witnesses. He was being tested. The world was asking him if he had learned anything from the fire, or if he was still just a man made of smoke and regret. The answer would be found on the long, cold road to Denver. They traveled for 2 days, a grueling journey through the high country. Jedediah pushed them hard, his knowledge of the terrain their only advantage. On the third night, camped in a shallow cave hidden by a curtain of frozen waterfall, they saw the distant flicker of lanterns far below them. Finch's men, casting a wide net, sweeping the foothills. They were relentless. Jedediah put the fire out immediately, plunging them into absolute darkness and cold. He pulled Elara close, wrapping her in his own thick coat, shielding her small body with his. They sat there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the wind and the faint, menacing shouts of the men below. In that shared darkness, a new kind of intimacy formed. The cold and fear stripped away everything but the essential truth: they were alone, together, against the world. "Were you a soldier?" Elara whispered, her voice muffled by the wool coat. Jedediah hesitated. It was a part of his life he had buried even deeper than his grief. "A scout," he finally answered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "I was good at finding things." "And hiding you couldn't hide from them," she stated, not as a question, but as a fact. From the fire he stiffened. He had never spoken of it. Not to anyone. The silence stretched, and he felt the weight of her expectant gaze even in the pitch black. "No," he said, the word a ragged exhalation. "I was tracking a stray. I thought it was more important than getting home before dark. I was proud of my skill." The fire came fast. By the time I saw the smoke, it was too late. He felt a small hand find his in the darkness. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. "It wasn't your fault," she said softly. Fire has no one to blame. Her simple absolution was a kindness he had never allowed himself. He reached into his satchel and pulled out a small object, pressing it into her hand. It was a small wooden horse, its surface worn smooth with time. "This was my daughter's," he said. Her name was Lilio. In the darkness of the cave, surrounded by enemies, a broken man gave away the last piece of his daughter, and in doing so, finally began to reclaim himself. He was no longer just a protector, he was a father again, in a way he never thought possible. By the 5th day, their supplies were low and the cold had settled deep into their bones. Jedediah knew they needed shelter, a real fire, a warm meal. He knew of a place, a small trading post in a sheltered valley, run by a widow named Martha. She had been Sarah's friend, a kind, tough woman who had seen her own share of hardship. It was a risk. The post was on a main trail, but it was their only chance. They arrived at dusk, two frozen specters stumbling out of the wilderness. Martha's face, etched with worry lines, broke into disbelief and then relief when she saw him. She pulled them inside without a word, her eyes taking in their ragged state, the girl's exhaustion, and the grim set of Jedediah's jaw. She asked no questions, simply providing hot stew, warm blankets, and the profound comfort of a safe harbor. For one night, they were not fugitives. Ilara fell asleep by the fire, the wooden horse clutched in her hand, the first peaceful sleep she'd had in a week. Jedediah sat with Martha, the silence between them filled with shared history and unspoken grief. "You look like a man carrying the world, Jed," she said finally, her voice gentle. Heavier than usual, he told her everything. The girl, the map, Croft. Martha listened, her face growing hard. "That devil," she murmured. "He's been squeezing everyone. My supply lines are choked. He's trying to starve me out." Her story was a piece of the same puzzle, another life being crushed under Croft's ambition. The sanctuary she provided was an act of defiance. But defiance has a cost. As dawn broke, the sound of approaching horses shattered the peace. It was Finch. And he hadn't come to talk. Jedediah grabbed his rifle. "Martha, get Ilara out the back. There's a ravine, follow it west." Martha nodded, her face pale but resolute. "Godspeed, Jedediah." As she hurried the sleepy girl away, Jedediah barred the door. Finch's voice boomed from outside. "We know she's in there, Jedediah. Send her out, and Croft might let you live." Jedediah answered by firing a shot through the wall, splintering wood next to where Finch's head would be. The world erupted in gunfire. He held them off, buying time, but they were too many. They set fire to the barn. Then, a single, piercing scream from the back of the house. Jedediah's blood ran cold. He raced to the back room to see Martha lying on the ground, a dark stain spreading across her dress. One of Finch's men stood over her, reloading. The world went red. Jedediah moved, no longer a scout, but an instrument of pure, cold fury. When it was over, two of Finch's men were dead, and he was gone, smoke and blood staining the morning air. He knelt by Martha. Her breath was shallow. "He can't win," she choked out. "Don't let him win." He watched the life fade from his wife's last friend. The cost of running had just been paid in blood. He found Ilara huddled in the ravine, her face streaked with tears and soot. He knelt before her, the smoke of the burning trading post coiling around them like a shroud. He looked at her face, and he saw the faces of all of Croft's victims. He saw Martha. he saw her mother. He saw Sarah and Lily. He had spent 6 years running from a ghost, only to find himself hunted by a real monster. Running was a luxury they could no longer afford. Every mile they put between themselves and redemption only spread the sickness, leaving a trail of bodies and burnt-out lives. Martha's dying words echoed in his head, "Don't let him win." It wasn't a plea, it was a charge. He looked at the map, which Elara had kept safe inside her coat. It was a piece of paper, but it held the power to dismantle an empire of fear. But a map was useless if no one was brave enough to read it. He had thought the goal was Denver, to hand this burden to someone else, to some faceless federal authority. He realized now that was the coward's way out. That was the old Jedediah. The one who ran from fire. Justice wasn't in a far-off city. It had to be forged right here, in the heart of the valley, in the town that bore the ironic name of Redemption. Croft's power wasn't in his guns or his money, it was in the silence of the people he terrorized. He ruled because good people were too afraid to speak. He looked at Elara, this small child who had watched her mother die and had walked through a frozen hell, all while clutching a fragile hope. Her courage shamed his years of hiding. "We're not going to Denver," he said, his voice scraped raw by smoke and sorrow. "We're going back." Elara looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes searching his. She saw something new there. The haunted, hollowed-out look was gone, replaced by a cold, hard fire. She didn't question him. She simply nodded. They would not be the hunted anymore. They would be the reckoning. Together, they turned their backs on the smoking ruins of their sanctuary and began the long walk back toward the wolf's den. Sunday morning in Redemption. The church bell tolled, calling the righteous and the fearful alike. The townspeople, dressed in their Sunday best, walked with their heads down, their gazes averted, a community held captive by a collective, unspoken terror. Baron Croft stood on the church steps, accepting greetings like a king, his deputy Finch at his side, a wolf in the shepherd's flock. It was a perfect portrait of power, faith and fear, hand in hand. And into this carefully constructed tableau, two figures rode. A man and a child on a single, weary horse. They were covered in soot and grime, apparitions from the wilderness. Jedediah and Elara. They rode slowly down the center of the main street, and a hush fell over the crowd. People stopped, turning to stare. This was the hermit from the ridge, the ghost of Whisper Rock. And the girl, they recognized her from the wanted posters Croft had put up, claiming she was a lost orphan. Jedediah dismounted in front of the church, lifting Elara down. He didn't draw his rifle. He stood before Croft, the entire town his witness. "This girl's name is Elara," Jedediah said, his voice ringing out in the sudden silence, strong and clear. "You murdered her mother, Croft. You murdered Martha Collins. And you did it for this." He unrolled the oilskin map. He held it up for all to see. "You planned to steal their water," he said, his voice rising, pointing to the ranchers and farmers in the crowd. "To dry up their land and buy it for pennies. This map is your confession." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Croft's face, a mask of benevolent authority, twisted into a snarl. "This man is a madman. A killer. He's the one who killed Martha." Finch moved forward, his hand dropping to his pistol. He's lying, but Jedediah wasn't looking at Finch. He was looking at the town's junior deputy, a young man named Calloway whose face was pale with dawning horror. Calloway had been one of the riders at Martha's. He had seen what happened. "Was I lying, deputy?" Jedediah asked, his voice quiet but carrying deadly weight. Every eye turned to Calloway. The young deputy looked at Croft, at Finch, and then at the faces of his neighbors, the people he was sworn to protect. The spell of fear, so carefully woven, began to tear. In that moment of hesitation, the truth found its champion. Calloway slowly drew his pistol, but he didn't point it at Jedediah. He pointed it at Finch. "No," Calloway said, his voice shaking but firm. "Is not the spell shattered?" Finch, enraged by the betrayal, drew his gun. But Jedediah was faster. A single, deafening shot echoed through the street. Finch crumpled to the ground. Croft, his power evaporating before his eyes, stood alone and exposed. The crowd, silent for so long, surged forward, their fear finally burned away by a spark of shared courage. Justice, it turned out, wasn't a man with a gun. It was a community that had finally found its voice. The spring thaw came, slow and then all at once. The ice on the Blackwood River broke apart with a groan, and the water, clear and cold, ran its true course. With Croft in federal custody and his empire dismantled, a new spirit settled over the valley. It was a fragile thing, this hope, but it was real. The town of Redemption began the slow work of earning its name. The ranches that had been on the verge of collapse banded together, sharing resources and labor, their bonds forged in the shared memory of fear and the triumph of their stand. Jedediah did not return to his cabin on the ridge. He stayed, helping Elara and the Ute elders restore the riverbanks according to her mother's original, respectful surveys. He was no longer a hermit, but a part of something. He was quiet, still a man of few words, but his silence was different now. It was not the silence of absence, but of presence. One afternoon, he and Elara stood on a hill overlooking the valley, at a small gravesite marked by two simple stones. One for Sarah and Lily, and a new one next to it, for Elara's mother. He placed the small wooden horse on the earth between them. He had buried his family here, and in doing so, had found a new one. He was not just a widower or a guardian. He was home. He had faced the fire, and this time, he had walked through it and brought someone out with him. What we just witnessed isn't a story about the Old West. It's a story about the eternal present. It's about the deafening power of silence, the kind that allows injustice to fester in our communities, in our workplaces, in our world. Jedediah's cabin wasn't just made of wood and stone, it was built from the fear of engagement, the comfort of looking away. How many of us live in a fortress like that? We see the small footprints in the snow, the evidence of someone wronged, and we close the door, hoping the wind will blow the problem away. But the wind never does. The story of Jedediah and Elara is a testament to a simple, terrifying truth: courage is contagious. The choice of one man to finally speak, of one deputy to finally stand, can break a tyrant spell. The question isn't whether you have the strength to change the world. The question is, do you have the courage to change your own silence into a voice? What you do with that voice is your story. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to our channel and join a community dedicated to exploring these timeless questions. Share your own moments of choice in the comments below, because every story shared is another light against the darkness.